Starting. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to share this link. Seems like the Wi-Fi went down in the middle of the talk, which is totally planned. Let's distribute this through the Facebook event. Does that work? All right. Nope. There we go. Live stream went down. Here is part 2. Live streaming live. All right, cool. Hopefully that will help some people out. Great. I love that little cover image there. It's kind of creepy. Okay, let's get back into things. Sorry for the delay, folks. And we are back. Okay, so as I was saying, this is just a doodle I made the other day. I wanted to make like a little K-form. It came out looking like this. But it's still like a pretty geometric shape, but it's more organic than a pixel design. And you can see that it's informed by these grid lines. Everything from the lines that bisect at the grid line to the shapes underlying, it all perfectly lines up. And that's basically the technique I used to make all the logos, really. I can't say that I've ever gone more than like a 32 by 32 grid on a logo I've made. Now a few tips that are like pretty critical for making a really even an even project here. We have a few considerations when we get into angles. So if we're using a grid to make, say, a logo that's like this, let me just quickly draft something for you. All right, so we have this outer box that's one grid line thick. And let's say I want a slash in the middle. That's our entire brand. Now, using the pen tool, you can press P or select the pen tool on the side. You can draw diagonal lines. And there's a few things to know about these. If we want the whole point of using grids is that it makes things consistent. So if we're using the pen tool at 1 pixel apart or 1 grid line apart to make that diagonal, it's actually, here, let me make this a different color so you can see. But it's actually going to be thinner than our vertical lines and horizontal lines. This is just pretty basic geometry, but you see it gets thicker and thicker as I go more vertical, and it gets thinner and thinner as I go outwards. So there are a few ways to get around this. But when I was a younger designer, I would put things out with things like this, thinking it was like the same, but it's really not. So a few ways around this. The main technique that I'll use is using the line segment tool and giving it a stroke that is equal to the thickness of 1 grid line. So let's use the stroke tool. Stroke means line. You can press the, what is this, backslash, or click the line segment from your toolbar. And with grid snap still on, we'll go from corner to corner of a box. And I'm going to make the stroke thickness, or the stroke color, the same color as my other object. Let's make this royal blue, Klein blue, IK blue, as they say. All right, so let's check the thickness of one of our grid lines. What is the size of a pixel? Well, I can do that by drawing a box and looking up here at the transform output. It says that this is 8 pixels wide. So now what I can do is take this perfectly centered line and make the thickness 8. You'll see that it goes off the end, and all I need to do there is put a clipping mask on it, or I could use the Pathfinder tool to cut that off. That's a more advanced trick, I guess. Or honestly, I could just kind of pull this in and hide it. Now that line is going to be the exact same thickness as one of these. I can show you by making it a different color and standing it up alongside the others. See that? So if you're getting into the nitty-gritty of logo design and you need your strokes, your circles, your diagonals to be actually orderly and equidistant and perfect, feel free to use the line command to make diagonal sections. All right. Now, before we move on, does anyone have questions about using Illustrator, using grids, ways that it is really cool? Yeah.
When you move the lines down, did you use the indirect tool to move the top?
Yeah, so exactly. You'll see that actually we're able to get the color of our cursor to change. When it's black, that means that we're selecting an entire object. And when it's white, that means we're selecting points on an object. Now, in vector art, everything is paths and points. That's how vector is able to scale. It's kind of mathematically generated. So you can use the direct selection tool to move one of these points around. The way to do that is by pressing A on any keyboard. It'll make your arrow white, and yeah, you can go into the direct selection tool. If this was the black cursor, it would move the entire object, whereas I can use the direct selection tool to move just one part of it. And look, we've just branded a European bank or something. Looks great. Yeah, but again, this is cool because it's minimal and it's simple. If we wanted more fidelity, we could scale it up. When I'm designing here, all I would do is bring it up to the next size. And since I doubled the thickness of everything, I need to also double the stroke thickness to keep things in line. But that's kind of the workflow that I'll go through in that. Cool. Are there any other questions about Illustrator? Now, this isn't a talk about Illustrator. If you really want to get into it, there's some great ways to learn the tools online, or we can stay after and learn it. But I just want you guys to know how to use grids effectively within that system. And yeah, any other questions? Last call? Sweet. Let's get into Sketch. Woo! All right. So everyone open up Sketch. Let me go back to my presentation. So within web design, and everything I'm going to say about web basically goes for mobile, but with slightly different numbers and sizes. So, Rex, we still good on that live stream? Sweet, thank you. All right, let's catch up. All right, using grids in web design. So the reason we're switching to Sketch, you actually, if anyone was here a year or two ago, I gave a talk on web design for devs, and we did use Illustrator to make websites. Sketch has become a lot more popular because it has a lot of great plugins, and it has basically superior handling of objects and layouts. Illustrator is really good for graphics and logos, but I would encourage you to use Sketch for user interfaces. Okay, so here's an example of how grids are used in Sketch and in web design. Now back to Ibrahim's comment before that a grid is basically just a bunch of squares. Here's where that kind of breaks down. At least this is really just semantics, but it's good to know so you don't get confused. On web, when we say grid, we really mean this sort of columnar layout. And the columns will inform the horizontal spacing and sizing of objects. And then vertical rhythm is also informed by the horizontal spacing. Vertical rhythm just basically means how far apart objects and sections are. So here's a mock-up I made for a project called Bookhouse. We're making sort of open source library collections online. And this is like a final output. Here is the grid informing that. So in this case, I'm using a 12-column grid. Every column is equidistant. That's not normal, but it's how I like to design. When we're talking about these types of grids, we have columns, which are, in this case, the dark gray. And then we have gutters, which are the sort of negative space in between the dark gray columns. Those are also called margins sometimes. If anyone's in InDesign, these are called margins and gutters. And yeah, so you can see that the columnar layout here is informing the size of the shapes and the distribution of them. So let's get into exactly how to do that. Now in this case, the equivalent of using the toggle grid, which was Command apostrophe for Illustrator, is actually going to be Control L in Sketch. Sketch doesn't exist on Windows, so if you were confused about that, I'm sorry. Follow along with a Mac neighbor, or there are a lot of good alternatives for Sketch on Windows, such as going back to Illustrator. But in our case, to toggle the layout grid system is going to be Control L, and to actually set it up is going to be in the layout settings. There's like a 5-key shortcut for the layout settings, but don't worry about that. In this case, we're not going to use any sort of snap to grid for nudging and moving objects around, but what we will use is the arrow keys pretty frequently, and the super nudge, which is the shift arrow keys, which will move things around by units of 10, or you can customize that to be part of your like base 8 system. Okay, so we have a similar agenda. Let's totally ignore it and hop right in. So with Sketch, here, I'm going to create a new document so we're all on the same page. Press A to create a new artboard, and I believe you guys should have the same presets as me, so you can use the HD desktop mode to get an artboard here. Did everyone figure that out? Open up Sketch, press A, and then click on the desktop HD artboard under responsive web design. Cool. So what this is going to do is actually provide us with an artboard to work on. This is supposed to be like similar to the size of a computer screen. And unlike Illustrator, we're not designing, like, while logos are able to be designed in this like size independent world, web design and interfaces in general are made for very specific screen sizes. So in this case, paying attention to the numbers is absolutely critical, or else you'll have super massive text or text so small you can't read it. So just be aware of the numbers in this case. And since we do care about numbers, I'll let you know a few different types of grid systems around numbers. When you create your grid, you can do them in these sort of base X systems. So a base 8 grid will use 8 as the kind of key number, whereas a base 10 system will use 10 as the key number. You'll want to remember those two. Those are basically the only ones used these days. I like to use base 8 because it is very similar to mobile design. So that means that every dimension that I'm going to use is going to be a multiple of 8. Cool. So that said, let's set up our grids to be all the same. So in Sketch, click View, go down to Canvas, and click Layout Settings. All right. I'm going to teach you guys about the pretty basic 960 grid. This is really, really popular in web design. Most of the sites you use are probably on a 960 grid. That is blogs and kind of marketing sites, things like that. Other products might use more screen real estate, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the 960 grid. This means that the entire width of the content is going to be 960 pixels. So that said, let's go down here to gutter width. I believe this will be standard on yours, but we want to make the gutter width 20 pixels and the column width 60 pixels. Cool. You'll see, like, for anyone watching me, my standard is 40 and 40. I like designing with really big margins, really big gutters, but just to be familiar with like what's kind of popular or more standard, we'll use the 960. Make sure it's centered by clicking the center button. Make sure we're at 12 columns. Can anyone say why the number 12 is so perfect in this case? Yeah.
Because it's divisible by a lot of numbers.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly right. 12 is divisible by 3, 4, 2, 6. What this allows us to do is make all different types of layouts within this kind of grid system. So if you think of any popular website that you've used, you'll probably notice that it's not taking up the entire width of the site all the way down the page. You might have sort of 8-column shifted into reading space, and then it'll break out to like a 6-column section where there's 2 really big featured things. So that's being able to use that 12-column grid and divide it by 2, divide it by 3, divide it by 6. That's why it's really, really popular. Okay, so remember, use Command L to toggle it on and off. Is everyone at this stage? We have our grid, we have it on. Awesome. Now let's just kind of go through what I was just talking about, like being able to use this for different types of things. We're not going to design a website right now, but we're going to kind of make a wireframe for it. So let's start with a nav bar. Just make a full width strip on top. The height doesn't matter. And from here, again, we're just wireframing, so let's imagine that this square is going to represent our logo. By the way, I did that by selecting the rectangle tool. You might have it under Insert Shapes Rectangle or just pressing R. But I've customized my toolbar, so don't be scared if you don't see this. Cool, so we're going to make a full width nav bar, color it whatever you want. And then we've got our logo here. And you'll see that as I'm going through, I'm kind of using the grid system to inform the size of my stuff. So great, navbar is done. That's it. Let's go down into our content section. So just again, as an example, we can use this to do some pretty funky layouts. Let's say we have a featured image as illustrated by this lovely green box. And then we have a description next to it. We can draw that image out and have text next to it taking up 3 columns. So in this case, we have a 9-column featured image, a 3-column text area. I know I'm kind of whizzing by. I'll slow down and tell you exactly how to do this. So this is just a rectangle using Insert Shape Rectangle, and then I made a text box using text. And this will say something. Let me just pull up a really super cool tool to grab some text. Great. Looks beautiful, doesn't it, guys? All right. So you'll see that as we go down this page, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to use this grid. So we have a big featured section. You've seen this on sites where they'll start off with a really big image of their product. They'll explain what it does. They'll come down here and have these sort of, the famous 3-circle feature thing. The way these are done is by, just making your objects the same size as the grid. So I've just made 3 circles by doing Insert Shape Circle or Oval. I've made them the same size as 4 columns. Again, 12 divided by 4 gives us 3 circles to play with. And we can go from here. So let's say these are our 3 features. This is going to say something like speed. And then we'll have one that says lots of money. And our 3rd feature will be always on every day. Okay. Here's an example of using the grid to inform things that aren't on the grid. So our circles are going across 4 columns, right? But that text is kind of just floating. So let's use those circles to inform where the text should go by selecting both and pressing center. At this point, I know I'm going pretty fast because there's a lot of material to cover. the actual designing of the stuff within Sketch is not as important as like knowing the concepts behind it. Cool. So we've got 3 beautiful things. I want to mention that, as I said in the beginning, I use a much more spaced out grid. I think that as screen sizes get bigger and bigger, people are going to move more towards these. So while we started with a grid that was, what is this, 60 pixels wide for the column and 20 pixels wide for the gutter, let's actually go up and press View on a new artboard. So the way I did that, by pressing A, click Desktop or Desktop HD again, you'll get a new artboard, and then you can just copy and paste your content over if you choose to. But you'll see that if I make my grid bigger here, and by bigger I mean more spaced out, I'm going to go to Canvas, Layout Settings, and just make this 40. So now we have a gutter width of 40 and a column width of 40. If I use this for the same type of content, it'll have a little more room to breathe. I'm just going to ballpark this. What's great about Sketch is they have really nice snapping features. So you see these red lines coming up as I draw and move stuff. Again, just ballparking, but in real life I would pay more attention to those snapping areas. But you'll see that like with bigger gutters, we have a little more room to breathe in this document, as illustrated by these 2 examples. So I encourage you to be aware of the different types of grid systems you can use, and play with them. Don't kind of feel restricted to any one. And then who in the room is a developer? Is a CS major? Awesome. So you guys are the ones who are actually going to be coding this up. Actually, while we're at it, who's a designer? Who right now is a designer? Sweet. And who's maybe an aspiring designer, just really interested in this cool stuff? Everyone else. Great. So another really cool thing about grids is that for our developer friends who are going to actually be making these websites, the numbers are perfect. We're not handing them kind of ballparked stuff. We're able to duplicate values for dimensions and use kind of consistent variables. When I'm doing design work with my developer partner, we've gotten to a point where he's able to estimate distances just by like looking at it and knowing how the number system is set up. What that means is, obviously if he sees 3 objects that are spaced apart like this, he'll know that I'm using the grid and understand that it's 4 times whatever the column width is and the gutters combined. So not only does this make your life easier as a designer, but the developers who are going to be working with you are also receive this amazing new workflow. Sweet. And while we're talking about workflow, I think a lot of people, when they're designing, will kind of, they don't know exactly how big to make something or how small to make something. And what's great about using a grid back to Illustrator for logo designs, or here with web design or mobile design, these values and these distances are all kind of preset for you. You don't need to make as many decisions. If you really believe in this idea, and by the way, this isn't like any sort of radical like secret thing. Like this is standard in design. Every designer uses grids who's in industry. At least for web design, definitely. Maybe not as much for graphics, but it allows you to make these decisions much faster by saying, okay, you know what? Actually, this text is only 3 words per line. I want to make that bigger. I want to make that text area bigger. So I can just kind of reel this back and split this in half, 6 by 6, right? So that's 6 columns across and 6 columns for text. Okay, well that's actually too much. So now let me split the difference, or at least sort of split the difference. So maybe I'll give this 5 columns for text and what is that, 7 columns for picture. And okay, that's perfect. You see how the decision making is much faster than kind of saying, all right, blindly without grids. All right, well there and that'll do. All right, good. By using grids, you'll see that this is totally off, and you can kind of snap it out. So if this is a new concept to anyone, I encourage you to go back to maybe old projects you've done and just place a grid on top of it and see how you can line things up. I think you'll be pretty amazed at, if you left that project thinking like, oh, I like this, but it's just not perfect to me. If you throw a grid on it, chances are that it'll sharpen it up and really add that bit of order that might have been missing. Sweet. So let's hop back into the presentation. That was basically all I wanted to go over. I wouldn't call these necessarily like super technical skills. There's no, if you're a designer, you're pretty familiar with some of these tools that I've been talking about. And the new thing is really just kind of living by the grids, being one with the grids. And I encourage you to kind of use that to inform your designs as you go forward. Again, just to recap what we went over, in logo designs, we went over how to construct the grid using the preferences, knowing how to toggle it on and off and snap to it. We learned how to make shapes within the grid, snapping to those grid lines and making really beautifully proportioned objects. We moved it within the grid by nudging with our arrow keys while selecting it, or by using the direct selection tool to select points within an object and then moving those around. We talked about fills versus strokes, how in diagonal objects you might have a thinner section, but using a stroke with a defined width will help you make that consistent. We talked about scaling. That's switching from an 8x8 grid to a 16 by 32, and how that'll increase the fidelity of your designs if needed. And we talked about breaking the grid, using it to inform organic shapes. And then within our web design agenda, we talked about basically the same things. Also design patterns. That's things like a 6 two-column objects to make up a sort of grid array, or 2 featured 6-column things. Those are called design patterns. You might see them, or actually it's related to design patterns. If you see stuff around the web, you can use this to inform that. So yeah, again, just to wrap it up, there was that quote that I really liked. The solution to the design problem should emerge from its content. The grids kind of help align and order that content without really influencing you that much. But it'll make everything you make or that you create really beautiful. So with that, we'll wrap up here. And if you guys have any questions, we can go over it. Thanks, folks. All right. Any questions? What do we want to talk about? All good? Yes?
A quick, technical question on Sketch. How did you change the grids again?
Yeah, totally. Noga asked, how do we change the grids in Sketch? So looking at these 2 different artboards, we see that the grid on the left has thicker columns and thinner gutters. Columns on the right are thinner, but more consistent with the gutters. The way I did that was by selecting the artboard you want to work in, pressing View, going down to Canvas, and then at the bottom we'll see Layout Settings. And within here, we can adjust all of the. Are you at that panel? Yeah. So we can adjust all these things. We only played with kind of tweaking the gutter width and the column width, but you can also do a lot of cool things if you want to do the math for it. So for instance, our agency Minimill just started using a new 4848 grid. This is on the base 8 system, which means that we use 8 as a key unit for vertical and horizontal spacing and sizing. And so to do the math here, if we want every column and every gutter to be 48 pixels wide, well, if it's a 12-column grid, that means we have 12 columns and 12 gutters. So we can do 48 times 24, which is 12 plus 12, and we'll get 1152. We can plug that into our total width, center it, and then make 48 both of these numbers. So that's a grid that I created myself. I mean, it's just math, right? But it's a grid that is not like standard, but it allows us to space things. Oh, actually, I forgot to center it. But it allows us to make things breathe even more by breathe, I mean give them space between other objects so it's not crowded. It allows us to take up more of the screen size and not leave as much gutter on the side. You see all this gutter here versus the one here. I just started using this. I have no consensus on it yet, but I like it so far. So I encourage you, if you're at a more advanced stage, to experiment with the width of your grid, both overall and the proportions between gutter and column width. Cool? You have another question? Yeah, what's that?
So like when you're spacing things between and you're doing 8 by 8, like the colors, like when you just shift down, it's 10. So like how is it? Can you change it to a percentage?
Yes, that's a great point. Noga asks, how do I nudge things around within my base 8 or base 10 system? We only talked about using grids for horizontal spacing, but I'd encourage you, again, this is a 48 and 48 grid, so that means 48 pixel columns and gutters. So I use 48, by the way, is 8 times 6, and thus I get to use 8 to inform a lot of different dimensions. So if I have like an element size like this, and I want to space them out in an array, I can see that this is 48 apart, so I'll make this 48 apart. So that's what I mean by like a sort of base X system. I could also, let's say, I want my array to have a really thin, lower spacing, I guess, or vertical spacing. I can do this, which is still informed by that 8 system. Now, Noga's question was about nudging. Nudging means to move an object with the arrow keys. Every system will have a sort of basic nudge, which is going to be moving by 1 pixel by just straight up using the arrow keys. In Sketch, you can press Shift and nudge it around at 10 units. Now, I just, like 2 days ago, downloaded this plugin called, I think, Nudge It? No, not Nudge It. Nudge Sketch Custom plugin. Let's try this. Oh, come on, I was so close. So this plugin will allow you to set your nudge distance, your like big nudge, super nudge distance, to a different number. So if you have fully committed to a base 8 system instead of a base 10 system, then you can use this plugin to make your shift arrow keys 8 pixels. By the way, this 60 by 20 is actually on the base 10 system. So if you're using the 60 by 20 grid, you're going to want to space things out by 10, 20, 40, things like that, versus the base 8 system. I know these are a lot of like overwhelming numbers. I hope you've been following along. Let me know if you have clarifications needed. Any other questions? Technical or like totally zoomed out conceptual stuff? Last call. Okay, great. Thank you for coming. I'll be here for another few minutes to talk about special things. All right. Thanks for tuning in, folks.